Okay, just a sec here. Okay, Barbara, we are live.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Barbara Peterson, the Poison Pen. I'm home in my office, and I'm just delighted to be talking for the second time with his second book, Wild Prey, with Brian Klingborg, whom I think of as an old China hand. I've always loved that British phrase, don't you? An old India hand or an old
Yes.
China hand. What's
Yeah.
that actually mean?
I guess they had a hand in something. For
No,
better or worse.
I think it's somebody that's had hands-on experience living in, one of the colonies or something. So you certainly in your resume, I mean, you have a degree in Chinese cultural, is it anthropology? Do I have that right?
Yep,
Yeah. But
anthropology.
you've obviously been in China. So to that degree, you're an old China hand.
Yeah, I suppose. I lived in Taiwan for all told 4 years, and first went to China in 1987, which when it was far different than what it is now. In those days, I traveled by train, hard sleeper or soft sleeper. There wasn't much difference. And one of my memories is the curiosity that I was met with, because there weren't a lot of foreigners. And also going to places like Shanghai, which in those days were still sort of, the cultural remnant of when the foreign concessions were there. And nowadays you go there and there's no sign of that. All the old buildings are eradicated and they're skyscrapers. But yeah, I was still there during the Iron Rice Bowl period. Then I went back later to visit a couple of times, and things had changed greatly. So yes, I've seen China transform. I didn't spend that much time in China proper, but I have seen it change over the years.
My only trip to China was in 1997, which was anticipating the handover of Hong Kong, which we did. But I can remember Shanghai, the island was basically empty. Now it's all skyscrapers and it looks like Sydney, but it didn't, or Sydney looks like Shanghai, whichever way you want to go. And the big excitement of our visit there was that the first Kentucky Fried Chicken franchise was opening. And for the first time, and it was a real issue for the city, they had, plastic, fast food, junk, garbage and everything to contend with, because that was the soft end. But we went over to Macau on one of the fast water foil, whatever it all was. And Macau was still kind of Portuguese. Because it actually, the handover there was a little bit later, and there were old buildings. We had lunch and it was like a Portuguese restaurant. There was a temple down, and a little museum for fishermen and all. And now, if you look at Macau, it looks like Las Vegas.
Yeah, when I was 18, I met the woman that I later married, and she's the one who kind of inspired my interest in Asian culture. She had grown up in Hong Kong and had been to Macau and so on and so forth. So when we were 19, she actually took me to Hong Kong, I came from a small town in California, and it was mind-boggling to me. And I can remember her taking me to Macau specifically because that's the one place you could get good baked bread. Chinese bread is not like European bread. So she took me over there to get me some delicious baked rolls. That was my first experience with Macau.
Wow, that's where I learned to drink Vino Verde, which I've stuck with ever since. And I absolutely love it. But I mean, it's really hard to. Tom Bradby wrote a fabulous book set in China in the 1920s. I think it's called Rain. And he really evoked the concessions, the atmosphere of it and so forth. Whatever, didn't they call it the Bund or some such thing?
The Boon was the walkway along the front of the.
And I mean, it was, there was such a international flavor and so forth. And now so much of the world looks the same. And I was thinking about Harbin, the city that is close to Inspector Liu Fei's smaller town. Because I wanted to do the Trans-Siberian Railroad trip for ages. And somehow we'd never gotten around to it. But it seems so romantic, going across the Siberian landscape, and you'd wind up, with interesting stuff. And then we saw a YouTube video that somebody who had taken the trip made. And I'm telling you, that Harbin also looked like just another city.
Mhm.
High rises and the whole bit. And I thought, it doesn't look Chinese, doesn't feel Chinese. So I kind of lost interest in the whole Siberian trip.
Right. I think Harbin still has lots of patches of traditional architecture. As you know, I think we discussed this last time. Uh, it was kind of a Russian settlement early on because it was the
Exactly.
Germans. So, and there were a lot of Jewish people there, a lot of Russian people there. They, had a Russian newspaper, and they built things in Russian style early on. And so those are, they still have those buildings, but yeah, I'm sure a lot of it has been raised and modernized as happens everywhere. I live in Harlem, there's these beautiful brownstones here, but there are also a lot of high rises here.
Yeah, Miles Scottsdale is doing the same thing. A lot of our more Western architecture and the old sort of Spanish style stucco homes is giving away to some weird concrete modern with black trim and lots of glass. And it actually reminds me of prison more than anything else. It's not an architecture that I especially espouse. So when I was writing a little introduction to today's talk, which we sent out to your fans and so forth, it occurred to me, that China and Russia have this enormous long border up in the north, which is where Harbin, is, because you're setting this in China's northernmost province. And I wondered, how the Chinese are now viewing that Russian border, although you have to think that since Russia has bogged down in the Ukraine to the degree that it has, it's not really likely to take on China.
No, they're uneasy allies. Because I think they see use in aligning themselves together against the US primarily. So, politics makes strange bedfellows. China sees the US as their main rival on the world stage. China, as it ascends to a first world country and tries to assert its preeminence politically and economically around the world, Russia is not a threat to them currently. They know that. So, it behooves them to be friendly with Russia because it's one of the other countries that doesn't like the U.S. And there aren't some. Let me rephrase. I was going to say there aren't so many. Most countries don't like the U.S., but only some of them are really dead set against the U.S. because, for example, Cuba and so on. For political reasons. So, yeah, they have an uneasy alliance, and I think the invasion of Ukraine has really put China in a tough position. I remember reading that apparently the Russians did not tell the Chinese that they were going to invade, so it came as a surprise to the Chinese, which must have upset them greatly. And the Chinese are really, scrambling to try and figure out how to navigate this in a way that doesn't damage their credibility and their economic, livelihood. So,
but isn't it interesting that while both countries are supposed to be communist, Communist Party leadership and the whole bit, inevitably, so far, with the exception of Kerala, India, communism always seems to lead to autocracy. We have Putin, we have Xi in China. Erdogan would do it if he could. The guy in Hungary would do it if he could. But, look back at Romania. They always seem to end up with some kind of a dictatorship, even though communism is, supposed to be more about uniting the workers and, the whole bit. But it's not. It never seems to end in democracy.
I think some people might say that the U.S. came very close to a dictatorship and autocracy. So,
well, exactly.
So I don't think it's unique to communism. I will say, and it's not my area. I didn't really study communism or socialism. I will say, writ large, it doesn't really seem to work very well as an efficient way to run a country. I'm not sure a democracy or whatever we have does either.
Not at the moment.
Yeah, so everything gets messy. I guess for me, looking at Asia, there's a couple of interesting examples. One would be Singapore, which was essentially a military dictatorship. There was a strongman there who was able to guide it through its split with Malaysia and create the powerhouse that it is now. And Singaporeans might say that they, were willing to give up certain freedoms or liberties in return for security and economic strength, which they have. You can remember back in the day when people talk about you couldn't grow your hair long, you couldn't spit gum on the sidewalk, you would get caned. There were a lot of things going on in Singapore that wouldn't be tolerated in other countries. The other country, which I find interesting, I don't know that much about the politics, but I've been there many times, is Vietnam. Vietnam is a socialist country, but the leadership there, I think of as very in the mold of Deng Xiaoping, who decided that, we're socialists, we're communists, but capitalism ain't so bad. We don't want people to be poor necessarily. So in Vietnam, it's kind of a free-for-all. Have you ever been to Vietnam?
Yes, I have been, and I found it unbelievably capitalistic. It was like, why did we ever do this war? Because they've ended up more capitalist than we are. And if you ever go to the War Museum in Hanoi, the what they call the American War only occupies like a few square feet, because their war for centuries, like 1,000 years, has been with China.
That's right. That's correct. Yeah. But if you just go to Saigon and you go to any roundabout and see all the scooters, you can see that, the government may try to impose rules on people, but people kind of do what they're going to do. And I saw the transformation of Vietnam starting in, I guess the early 90s, because my wife was born there and left at the fall of Saigon when she was a little kid and didn't go back for 20 years. And then we started going back when we were in our 20s. At the time, the village where she grew up and the house that she grew up in had electricity, but nothing else. No running water, no refrigeration, no stove. They cooked over charcoal in the back, no running water. So going to the bathroom was interesting, taking a shower. But every year when I went back, subsequently, you saw improvements. So now they have, it's not a modern house, but it's a nice house. A couple of the rooms have air conditioning. So there's progress there. And I can remember back in those early days, my wife's uncle, they were one of the first houses to have a refrigerator. And he was an entrepreneur. So what he would do is he would do things like freeze water and make ice. And he would go down the street and he would sell ice to people because they didn't have refrigerators. The point being, in Vietnam early on, the people were like, we're going to make our lives better however we can. And the government was like, as long as you're not doing anything wildly illegal or counter to our authority, be our guest. So there's different approaches to what a socialist country does with their economy and their society.
Well, we can talk about Myanmar as we get into this, because part of your book has Myanmar. I'm happy that we went to Myanmar in that brief window when they were about to let Sue out of jail and before it's all gone south again. I mean, I wouldn't go now. But
when did you go?
That's a really good question. What was the year she was released from prison? Because it was the year before.
2010, 2011, 2011.
All right. I think it might have been something like 2011 or possibly even 2012. I mean, it was, I would say 10 years ago. And, everybody was hopeful that they'd broken the military and the dictatorship was gone. And, and it only lasted a little while. But anyway, we're digressing. Let me go back and say that Wild Prey, we do have autographed copies, which Brian has kindly signed for us. As he did for his first book. So let's talk a little bit about Wild Prey. Why did you decide? I love the tiger thing, but why did you decide Burma's a long way from Harbin? I mean, you've got to go all the way south. What interested you in trying to bring Harbin and Burma together?
Well, I think it was just the construct of the plot. The genesis of the book was COVID-19. I started writing it, probably the summer of 2020 when COVID-19 was in full swing. And I realized I couldn't write a book about China without addressing COVID in some fashion, especially since the prevailing theory was COVID-19. There's lots of viruses that are similar to that, but COVID-19 originated in a wet market in Wuhan, China. And I didn't know at that point, knowing it would take me a year to write the book, and a year for it to come out, what the future would be like. But I knew that I had to address it in some manner. I also knew that people would probably be pretty sick of COVID by that time. So I didn't want to make it a fundamental part of the plot. But I did think about, how will it impact daily life? Will there be, regular health checks and so on and so forth? So that occurred to me that I had to address the elephant in the room. And the other part of that was, it kind of had a natural connection to endangered animal trafficking, because that's, potentially how it all got started. A couple of critters in a wet market got their, cooties together, and suddenly we have COVID-19. And as you know, in China, the Chinese have for thousands of years seen food as medicine, and they ascribe certain qualities to food. This food is warming, this food is cooling, this food will augment your yang essence, this food will help rebalance your qi, and so on and so forth. And they have a long history of doing this. But as the world has changed and the nature has changed, a lot of the animals that they probably originally were, eating for health reasons have become endangered. And so that's one thing. And also, they become scarcer, and with scarcity comes value. So in the endangered animal trafficking, issue has become quite serious in China. So these two concepts, COVID and endangered animal trafficking, seem to fit together. And so that's how I came up with the original idea of Lu Fei investigating a restaurant that sells contraband items, and then following the trail down to its source, which is deep in the sweltering jungles of Myanmar. And again, of course, I made up the plot and the characters, but almost all the plot points are taken from reality. There are restaurants like the ones that I described. This issue of animal trafficking and drug manufacturing in Myanmar it's a fact. It's out there, and there's plenty of journalists who have done a better job exploring that than I have.
Well, yeah, I mean, Myanmar is desperate for various sources of income. I'm trying to remember, is it jade? What is the precious substance in Myanmar, the mining? Isn't it jade?
I'm not sure, but yeah, it's probably jade. I
think it is. I think but they don't have an enormous amount of resources to, export, but they still have a lot of wild land. So,
right. They have a lot of natural resources, but they don't have the infrastructure to harvest them in a renewable way. And it's a chaotic place with mountains and valleys and jungles and forests. So I think it's very difficult for the central government, doesn't have control over the whole country. So they can't really unite to create a solid.
Right. No, that's really true. And of course, they've done some deforesting too. So, along the Mekong is going to be something of a hazard. We started in Mandalay. We flew there from Bangkok and then sailed down the Mekong all the way to, I like to think of it as Rangoon, now called Yangon. Mm-hmm. And the Mekong it's a navigable river, but it's a tough navigation because it's very shallow. And it's easy to we got stuck on a sandbar and had to wait for hours for they sent a tug down, in our little boat, tied us up to a tree on the bank and then called for a tug. And we got stuck again, and they put up, it was really interesting to me, with a reckless disregard for consequences. They stuck up these like wooden planks on the railings of the ship, and we all had to walk the plank, We had to get the people off so the ship would lighten up so they could float again. But I did think that meant that the river commerce in Myanmar would not be super reliable if, in fact, it was only navigable some of the time and couldn't take heavy loads. So I can see, that your Burmese, I don't want to call her a warlord. What are we going to call her?
That's a good question. Mysterious. I don't know. I call her warlord, although she's not
Okay.
really a warlord. Businesswoman. How's that? She's a businesswoman.
Well, yeah, but anyway, she traffics in tigers, and that whole thing you talk about medicine for health, but there's a Chinese reliance among the men anyway on some animals for improved virility.
Correct.
Is the tiger one of them? Because I mean that's
Yes.
where the unfortunate rhino and bears in this country, I think it is.
Yeah. With the tiger, it's the tiger penis that they're going for. I don't know why rhinoceros horn and so on became seen as an aphrodisiac or enhancer. With the tiger, you can see it's obvious. It's just apples to apples. But yeah, who knows?
It doesn't appear that modern medicine is necessarily going to persuade them to give up the animals. And then there's some pretty exotic tastes in food, which, as you point out, the restaurant in Harbin is catering to. But part of that is just power, and part of that is showing off, because only the rich and the privileged and whatever it is can afford to do that or given access to it. I've read a lot of books about Chinese banquets, and I've always been grateful I have not been invited to one.
Oh, you haven't?
No,
we'll have to change that.
I've eaten in Chinese, in China. I have eaten in China, but I think going to a banquet with I'm a big fan of the Inspector Chen series by Chu Shalon. And, some of his descriptions of Chinese banquets, I would not particularly enjoy that.
Well, I mean, I used to work in Taiwan, and so I went to a number of Chinese banquets for business. And this is the interesting thing that maybe people don't think about if they don't eat a lot of Chinese food is when you think of Chinese food in the States, you think of rice. But rice is what poor people eat to fill up their stomach. So when you go to a Chinese banquet, there's almost no rice. It's these dishes which you're eating to fill yourself up as a to signify the wealth of your host or the fanciness of the banquet. I love rice, so I would go to these banquets and be on the lookout for. For most of my life, I've been a very picky eater. I probably didn't even really eat seafood until I was 18 or 19, and then suddenly I go to a banquet and they're putting sea cucumber in front of you. Have you ever eaten sea cucumber?
I have, not with any enthusiasm.
No. So the other thing is there are interesting different ways. Like Chinese people like meat with bone and gristle in it. They enjoy chewing on it, and I know
they eat chicken feet and rooster comb and stuff like that.
It enhances the taste and I think the mouthfeel, as people talk about now. But I would rather just have a chicken breast or something like that. So my experience with banquets was that I ate about a third of the dishes, as best I could. They're great fun because you drink a lot, but not all the food was to my taste, certainly.
Well, I think you could probably get away with that. I think in the Inspector Chen books, very often, because it was considered a mark of great favor that you were even invited, there was a lot of pressure, to eat the whole menu. And I mean, I've been in Chinese markets, and I'm not particularly excited at the bits of chicken or other stuff, or some of the more exotic things like pangolin. But anyway, Inspector.
To that point, though, Scottish people eat haggis. So there's all kinds of cultures who eat very strange things and enjoy them. More power to them.
A lot of it depends on how your palate is educated, I think, when you were young. I remember my first glimpse of tongue, and my mother was about to cook one, and I thought, I can't eat that, I thought, and I didn't eat it again for years until I actually came, for some reason, somebody served me a tongue sandwich, and I didn't know it was tongue. So I thought it was pretty good. And then when I asked and found out what it was, then there I was. Anyway, this leads to the fact that Inspector Buffet, the woman that he so much admires, actually has a little bar and kind of a restaurant, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, the Red Lotus. Yeah.
So the Red Lotus, I mean, it's fairly basic food, but nonetheless, it's food. Is it remarkably different in Harbin than, let's say, all the way south? And I mean, the languages are all so different. I would think up north that there'd be a lot more wheat. There'd be more like dumplings and pancakes and all. I mean, it's not a rice growing area. It's freezing up there.
That's exactly right. It's more wheat-based, dumplings, fried bread, but a lot of like sausages and things like that as well, and stewed foods because it's very cold up there.
So if Lu Fei goes in to visit with his lady friend, he's a customer who starts out, and we certainly saw that in the first book. What would she be serving him? I mean, did they eat a lot of soup?
Well, that's a bar, so she'd give him some salted peanuts and something pickled to drink with his alcohol. But if you went, so for example, I refer in the first book, maybe not the second book, to the Nine Dragons hot pot restaurant. So they'll go out and have hot pot as soon as it starts to get cold. And in the hot pot, they have a broth. They have different kinds of broth, and they can throw whatever meat and vegetables they want in there, and they eat it like a soup. They'll eat a lot of stewed chicken and probably like winter melon, things which are seen to be warming to the body. And the street food is, dumplings and grilled skewers of meat, stuff like that.
So when you wrote Thief of Souls, did you really anticipate giving Lu Fei a romance, or was it a place he hung out and then gradually you decided you really liked this woman?
I wanted to create a character who was tough as a policeman, but actually, had a very romantic, soft underbelly. And so part of that is his unrequited love for this beautiful widow, and for the first two books, he's basically chasing her and not getting it anywhere. So, I just wanted to add that dimension to his character, to point out that maybe to give him an excuse to spout some Chinese poetry now and then.
Well, I mean, I like her as a character. I think, she's genuinely a grieving widow and working hard, to survive and not easily derailed. I don't know how would she look at him as a professional person? I mean, as a cop, does he command any sort of respect or look like a good catch, or is that not a particularly desirable profession?
I think in the lower levels, it's not very desirable, and police aren't accorded a ton of respect, but he's a deputy chief. He's a graduate of a major university. So he would definitely have a good pedigree, a decent salary, and social status. So yeah, he would be a catch for sure.
So it's interesting that she sort of spurns that. Do you see him? I mean, remind us, why is he in this small town instead of actually in Harbin, which is the big city?
Right. So he graduated from the Beijing Police College, which is the premier police training institution in China. And then this is complicated because where you go in China has to do with your birthplace, your hukou status, your registration status. But to make it as simple as possible, his father was sent up north at some point, so he was able to go up north to work in Harbin as a policeman, and he worked his way up from constable first class or sergeant or whatever it was. I don't remember. If you graduate from a college, you don't start at the lowest level, up to detective, and then he seems to be doing this a lot. He was looking for a runaway teenage girl, and was told, check the train stations and things like that. But he wanted to check the local brothels, wondering if she had been somehow recruited into the sex trade. And he was told to stay away because the idea is that these brothels are paying protection money to the local police, his boss, essentially. So he shows up in a brothel to search for this girl anyway, and finds another woman with his boss. He happens to walk in on his boss with an underage prostitute. And knowing that he could file a report, but, the powers that be would not do anything about it, he just laid low, and his boss eventually engineered a transfer to him as an exile. He couched it as a promotion. Now you're a supervisor, you'll be a deputy chief, but get out of my city. So he was kicked out of Harbin. That's essentially how he ends up in this small town.
So as part of your continuing story arc, making him okay with being a small fish in this small pond, or are you intending him to work his way back up to a bigger arena?
No, he's content because there's a woman that he loves in Raven Valley, the woman who owns the Red Lotus Bar. And he's got a comfortable position. He knows the people that he's working with. He can do his work. He can help. I think I mentioned probably in Thief of Souls, maybe it was Wild Prey, that he feels like he's doing some good, unlike in Harbin. He's actually helping people rather than protecting some corrupt people above him. So he's content there.
But you do sort of make it clear that the corruption is in the bigger city, where there's more money and more power to grab. So was he ambitious originally, or was he never terribly ambitious?
I don't think he was terribly ambitious. I think he was somebody who, for whatever reason, his origin story is that his parents were caught up in the Cultural Revolution. And so his father was sent to the north, down to the countryside, as they called it. They would take anybody with an education or anybody whose parents were one of the undesirable categories, artist and professor, something like that. And they would send these kids, 15, 16, 17 years old, off to the countryside to learn good, solid work beside the salt of the earth peasants. So his father was caught up in that and sent to Harbin, which is where he met Lu Fei's mother. And then, they became romantically involved. Meanwhile, Lu Fei's grandfather, because he was a professor, basically was criticized, thrown out of his college, and essentially starved to death in a re-education camp. So that experience made Lu Fei have a strong sense of what is right and what is wrong. And that is why he decided to become a police officer. But he's not somebody, he's somebody who wants to do good with the role that he has, rather than become chief of this or something like that.
Well, I only asked because if he did go to the Premier Police College, he would have been. It's sort of like the difference between going to Oxford and, a small red brick university in England. So,
yeah,
in a way, it's not the normal career path or the normal path as somebody who graduates from an institution like that. I think in France, it's what do they call it? The polytechniques or something. There's a sort of, level of education preparation, right. And people who graduate from it tend to run the country. And so, if he's detached from that, because of the proximity of Harbin, do you feel like you've got enough material to work with that he can stay in the smaller place, but the crime will, find him, or he'll be sent to it because it is a big metropolitan area?
Well, that's a good question. So in Wild Prey, he ends up going to Harbin to track down this missing girl, and then follows her trail all the way down to Kunming, China, and across the border into Myanmar. So I have him going pretty far afield, to find his adventure. Book 3, which I've handed in the manuscript last week, so that'll come out next May, has him returning to Harbin and sort of completing a story arc, his character arc, dealing with his ex-boss and corruption in the district where he worked as a police officer. So that book is focused specifically on this topic of corruption in this part of Harbin, and it has a resolution to it. If there's a book 4, I'll have to start thinking about what that might be as soon as I finish the edits for book 3.
Right. Well, I hope there will be. I think, there was a while when there were several people writing about China, and now not really. Actually, I was thinking about that today because I did another reminder about a medieval mystery we're hosting tomorrow. And I was thinking back to when I started the store at the end of the 80s and in the early 90s, there was this wealth of medieval mystery, largely spurred on by Umberto Eco and The Name of the Rose, and then Ellis Peters. And now you can barely find one. And Roman mystery was really tremendous. And now there's really only 1 or 2 people. It's interesting, the cycles of publisher or interest. And now everybody that's been writing thrillers, focused on the Middle East is pivoting back to Russia because they've become the major enemy again. I wonder if it's because China to some degree is impenetrable or enigmatic or whatever you want to call it, makes it a lot more difficult to craft novels there, either as a visitor to China or Chinese. I mean, if you haven't lived there, I think it would be hard for you. At least we haven't gotten into cultural appropriation with you, because there's also this pressure about, you have to be what you're writing, which I think is terrible. I'm really opposed to it.
I have had, some people unhappy or just reject out of hand the book because it's not written by, a Chinese person. And I guess I understand the sentiment, but if you go down that road, many people couldn't write about many things. And
That's right.
I don't think it really makes sense. However, I can understand people being sensitive to other people being culturally insensitive when they're writing. The thing with China, which to your point is what you're saying, is if you haven't studied Chinese language, if you haven't visited, if you kind of haven't gone beyond the sort of, let's just say, like James Clavell surface, view of Asia as an exotic place, it's hard to have any nuance in your characters and your story. So what you find when you do find a lot of thriller writers who write about China, but China is their hero is an American CIA agent or whatever, and his antagonist is a Chinese assassin or a politician or general or whatever. And some of those are good books and they do a lot of research, but often there's some cultural nuance which is missing. I am not Chinese, but I spent all of my academic years studying Chinese history and religion and anthropology. I've lived there. I do get things wrong sometimes. I do a huge amount of research, even for these books. I don't make anything up, The first book, we went so far as to have a PhD student from Oxford, from China, read it just to make sure there wasn't anything incorrect or whatever. I don't know if you remember, but in the first book, there was a plot point about Louboutin shoes, which, are the shoes with the red soles that are $800, $1,000, whatever. I don't know how much they are, $2,000.
Louboutin. Yep. It's a very famous French shoe manufacturer. And if you have one, you tend to cross your legs and wave your foot. Everybody
That's right. That's right.
Soles. Yes.
I had rendered that in romanization, which I had found somewhere on the internet, and she said, no, that's not what they're called. They're called Hongdixie, red bottom shoes in China. So there's little things that I miss just because I don't know, but I've done my best to do right by Lu Fei, and I've always done my best with all the characters to provide them with nuance. They're not all good and they're not all bad. They're three-dimensional people. A lot of characters have complained that Lu Fei is kind of a jerk, and I'm like, he's curmudgeonly, cranky, but I think that's kind of endearing. I think of like there's plenty of cranky detectives from literature, and I think it adds something to it. So anyway,
I think Bosch is oftentimes quite cranky, and so is Rebus. So that part is not, I think, wildly askew. If in fact you were to think about writing something else, would you stick with China, or do you think you would try your hand at something different?
I don't think I would stick with China. but I do have an idea to set a book in Vietnam, starting just before the Tet Offensive. And it would be, a mystery or a crime novel. And every year would be another year passing in Vietnam during the Vietnam War, dealing with the local police, the military, the CIA, the Viet Cong, and so on and so forth, up until the fall of Saigon, essentially. And I think, there's a lot of material there that would be interesting. In fact, that is the book that I started to write before I wrote Thief of Souls. And I did a lot of research, but then I one day said to myself, I don't really speak Vietnamese. I've been there, a dozen times, but there's something kind of inauthentic about what I'm doing at this point. Why don't I just go with what I've spent years and years doing, which is why I wrote the first Liu Fei book. But I would like to return to that idea in Vietnam and do some more research. And
that would actually be writing historical fiction,
Right. And there is an advantage to that, because if you're not writing about something contemporary, I think readers look at it a little bit differently. So when you're writing about contemporary China, there's a lot of readers out there who feel like they have some ownership or some knowledge about contemporary China, and they're looking to ding you a little bit if they don't agree with your viewpoint or the way that you presented something. I've gotten a couple of odd reviews where I just felt like, oh, here's somebody who took a couple of courses in modern Chinese history, and they don't like the fact that I'm writing this book. So, I don't know if that's true or not, but there's some safety in writing about historical events.
Well, yeah, there is, but I think you really have to ignore the disgruntled, because unfortunately, especially with social media and so forth today, everybody has their own agenda, their own personal story, and also, sadly, there's a constant, I think, kind of yearning for people to be seen or recognized. I mean, they're looking into that as one of the, well, I think we already know that's one of the motivations behind all these serial shooters, that, part of it is they just want the attention. And I think there are readers who can approach a book or something in that same vein, or use it as a platform without the book actually even being in question.
Right.
So, I can't even imagine if I were an author, I would never read an Amazon review or whatever. I mean, why bother? Lord. So let's talk a little bit about the trip that they take, because one of the things that happens in this book is Liu Fei has this, he wants to take the lady from the Red Lotus. He wants to have some sort of a romantic getaway with her if he could possibly achieve it. And so he works that into his investigation. And I actually went to Google Maps and, tried to figure out where he was going. So it's a kind of resort area, but not all that far from Harbin. So it's over what sea is that there? It's too far. Is it too far north for the Japan Sea? What are we talking about?
It's kind of, I think it's the Yellow Sea there, and it's a peninsula. And it's called Dalian, which is an old port town. And so because it's a port town, it's been taken over by the Russians for a period of time, and I think the Japanese for a period of time. So it's another place like Harbin that has a lot of European history and architecture to it, but it's known for its beaches, its parks. It's got an amusement park there. It's got an international beer festival. So it sounds like quite the happening place. I haven't been there, but it sounds like.
We went a couple of years ago, right before COVID. Our last trip ended up part of it going across the top of France, up the English Channel toward Amsterdam. We went to Deauville, which was a famous beach resort. Although any beach resort on the English Channel in the North Sea is kind of limited. It's cold up there. Right. And it was fascinating because what they had done is they had this huge boardwalk, and along it they had seats reserved for the famous people who had been there. So it's like walking through Grauman's Chinese Theater and see, the Hollywood stars on the home. It was really interesting. I took photographs of it. But I wondered if Dalian were a little bit like that. It was a bit out of date, but glamorous in a kind of older way. And, it's not like the Caribbean, it's,
Right.
it's a colder sea.
Yeah. My guess is it's very modern and they've rebuilt everything.
Oh, yeah.
It's frequented by Russian tourists, North Korean tourists, and Chinese tourists. So, it's a place that's really designed for tourists to come. Also, it's got an international port which ships direct to like 160 countries. And it's got a huge industrial park filled with manufacturing companies from Korea, Japan, the United States. So it's really a very modern metropolis at this point, but with these beautiful pockets of greenery and these pristine beaches, which are probably filled with millions and millions of beachgoers anytime the sun is out.
So how does Liu Fei manage to wangle himself a trip, and how do they get there?
Well, they take a train, and the missing woman that he's gone to Harbin, he's tracked to Harbin, he's tracked her to this restaurant which sells these contraband items. He's figured out that something nefarious has happened there. But the last place that he got a ping off her phone was Dalian. So he tells his boss that he's going to go to Dalian and track her phone down. Unfortunately, all he can do is go to the train station, which is the last place that this phone was found, and look around for it. And he ends up actually finding her phone by giving up almost. And then while he's having some lunch in the train station, he sees a homeless lady digging through the garbage, and he has an idea, and he asks her if she's seen such and such woman, and she says no, and then he says, well, do you pick up phones from the garbage? Because what happens in China is, especially the Xiaomi phones, are sold very cheaply. They're not really worth much. What's worth a lot is the software of the service. So often, you'll get a phone where if you steal the phone itself is not really worth anything. And so it's not worth wiping it. It's not like an iPhone here where people will wipe it and repurpose it and try and sell it on the black market. So he figures whoever's stolen this phone realized it's useless and has dumped it. So it turns out this homeless lady does in fact have bags and bags of phones she's picked up from the garbage, and he does find this phone, indicating that the missing woman was in Dalian. But after that, he doesn't know what happened to her.
But isn't there because I read this book some time ago, isn't there a third wheel that intrudes into, because he thinks he's going to bring the widow along on this trip to Dalian, and they're going to have a romantic a tryst, but then a third party intervenes. Right. So if I remember right, is a teenager.
Yeah, so actually the book starts off when a 15-year-old girl comes into the police station and reports her older sister missing, and tells Liu Fei that the older sister was working in Harbin to support the family.
Okay, that's
at
how
this particular restaurant. And this 15-year-old becomes Liu Fei's conscience. She sits in the lobby of the police station every day, waiting for him to do something. And he does, but it's not an easy investigation. And finally, he happens upon this idea of going to Dalian. He does. And he's just about to have a romantic evening with Yen Yen, his would-be girlfriend, when there's a knock at the door, and this girl has tracked him down and wants to know if he's found her sister yet. So, yeah, I have two daughters, and to me, one of my favorite parts of the book is this girl's quest for somebody to find her sister.
Yeah.
And chooses Liu Fei, and Liu Fei, knowing that he's going to undergo a huge amount of danger, that's part of why he does it, because this girl is really, she's really gotten into his head and made him care about her missing sister as well, when it seems like nobody else cares about this girl.
Well, yeah, no, she's a very powerful agent in it. But I also thought, if you're as a novelist, part of your craft is to string out this relationship. She's a
Mhm.
useful
Yeah,
tool in that because, otherwise, if she didn't show up, then the whole question would be, do they, do
right.
they or don't they? But because the girl intervenes, you get to push
Mhm.
that all down the road.
Yep, yep. It's the old Cheers conundrum. As soon as Sam and Diane get together, the tension is killed. So how do you, as a novelist, further a romantic story without ruining the tension between the characters and sapping some of that, excitement from the narrative? But
Well,
eventually,
I'm sorry, but Brian, in part, I subscribe to the idea that just because people do become a couple doesn't mean the tension goes away. It's just different tension.
sure. Yes, that could be interpreted in a couple of different ways, but
Well, I mean, it's true, in any long-term marriage, there's a lot of give and take and different phases in it. You're married. I've been married more than once, and I've been married to this husband for 31 years, coming up 32, and I learned a lot in previous encounters. So, one of the things I learned, well, there are two rules that we live by. One is whoever cares the most gets to win. And it's generally clear in any argument in the two stakeholders, it's usually clear which stakeholder cares more than the other. But you also learn that you really don't want to take anything to such an extreme that you can't back off. And, when you're younger and more ardent and more hormone ridden and, all the rest of it, or exhausted by children or whatever it might happen to be, it's a lot easier to get pushed into extremes.
yeah.
And so I think, you have to learn from that. Not everybody does, but in my case, it's certainly, and my husband, to give him equal credit, has done the same. But when you're writing, you're right. Will they or won't they is a huge question. But then after the will they and they won't they, the question is how do they do it?
Right.
How can they design a way? And if you look back at the Spencer novels, there was a time when Spencer and Susan were completely split. I think it was 3 whole books. And then the question, because that was also true in Bob's life, he had a rupture with his much loved wife. And then the question is, how do you go forward from that?
Right.
If you survive that, then you have to work out a different way of living together. And, so the tension really doesn't go away. It just morphs into something else. But, you've only done 2 books, so you're way too soon to talk about all that. And if you write more, it'll be an interesting subject to explore, because neither of them, she was married before, but she's been a widow now, but Lu Fei has never really had to consider living with somebody.
Yeah. And in the 3rd book, their relationship develops in a certain direction. So
Yeah. Well, I really like both of them. I think they're very interesting characters and, out of the common way. I love this genre, but very often you feel like it's rinse and repeat with a number of books. The domestic thriller ones are the ones that just, I think too often they read sort of all the same to me.
Yeah.
So I'm fonder of books series like yours, where it take me to someplace I don't know that much, and you have characters who are not doing, it's not like Mean Girls or whatever. I really have enjoyed your books, and I hope I'll look forward to the next one.
I can pretty much reliably say that nobody's going to predict what happens in this book. I mean, the entire story takes some twists and turns. You may get 1 or 2 twists, but I think there'll be a lot of surprises. I think that
Are you talking about Wild Prey, or are you talking about the next one?
Yeah,
Yeah, no, definitely so. And besides, I mean, there's hardly anybody that goes to Myanmar. So,
right.
If you're interested in travel and so forth, then that makes it a really entrancing read. I also want to say, I think it's a very nice cover. I'm not any kind of an art critic, but I particularly like the colors. I like the birds, the way that, the shapes of the buildings and the sort of V shape of the bird. I think it's really very well done.
Yeah.
Are you fond of it?
I love it. Yes.
I mean, Thief of Souls had a really interesting cover too. If I remember right, it was red and black.
Yeah.
and a bit geometric. Oh,
Had
good.
a-
Copy right there. Yeah, right.
Similar
And now
concept.
we have, we still have the buildings. That's interesting. I didn't think about that, but
Right. So, yeah, so these are definitely, I described what kind of buildings they have, the traditional buildings in Myanmar, and they replicated those. Those buildings often are set above the ground, and underneath the house, you'll have
yeah.
livestock and stuff like that. So,
Well, I mean, that's true, certainly true in Vietnam and so forth as well, and Thailand. I mean, part of it is to avoid flooding problems if you're up on stilts. Part of it is the storage thing. Part of it's air circulation because it's so hot,
Yeah.
and part of it is to save you from, creepy crawly,
yeah,
snakes and so forth. There are a lot of reasons for it. I'm wondering, in fact, they're selling waterfront property in Kauai and whatever it is. And I'm thinking, why aren't these people building on stilts like they do in other countries? Because it's just
Yeah.
crazy to assume that waterfront property is going to remain anything
Yep.
the same. I
It's
thought we were
gonna
thinking
get
that in
flooded.
Tahiti, that, people literally are at the water line and they're protected to some degree by the lagoons from tides. But
Mhm.
nonetheless, if the ocean rises,
Mhm.
you
And
know,
it will. And it will.
oh
So,
yeah, no, it's definitely going to. And so I do think that the Asian, some of these communities thought that through a long, long time ago. How do we
mm,
think? I think some of it's just rivers, isn't it? I mean, it wasn't all about rising tide. Some of it, I think, was about flooding by rivers.
sure. And, where you cultivate rice, you flood the fields, and there's, yay much water in those fields as long as that rice is growing. So it can be muddy. It can be, you have delta, the delta, which floods periodically, seasonally. So, yeah, it's a very practical way to build a house.
It is. Indeed, it is. Well, I really enjoyed our conversation, Brian. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Maybe you'll actually be able to come and see us with your next book.
Love to. Love to. I'll see you next May.
I think that would be great. Maybe we'll put together some sort of international, sometimes I think you can have an interesting day event or something if you can bring like things together. And I'm really fond of books that take me to other countries and all. So maybe we can put something together along those lines. Who knows?
Sounds great.
Yep, it does. Well, stay healthy. Thank you
You
very
too.
much. And don't
Thank
forget,
you.
again, we have autographed copies of Wild Prey. I know a lot of you bought Thief of Souls and you'll want to continue that. So anyway,